I have stood a great many posts in my years on the wall, and I have learned that the loudest moments of a palace are almost always the quietest ones. Not the state balls, where the music does your feeling for you. Not the salutes, where 1,000 feet strike the stone at once and the noise tells you what to think. No, the loud moments are the still ones, the ones where a single wrong thing happens in a room full of people who have all agreed, by long habit, not to see it. On the morning of the investiture of the Ashwater, I saw one such wrong thing walk through the western doors of the Hall of Vows, wearing a crown it had no right to wear. And I watched a man named Gethin Locke do the one thing none of us were prepared for. I have told this story badly 100 times to men who were not there. Let me tell it once properly to you. My name does not matter much to it. I was the third man on the inner cordon that day, 23 years old and green enough to still believe that the rules of the house were the same thing as the will of the powerful. Locke was my sergeant. He had been my sergeant for 2 years, and in that time I had heard him raise his voice exactly once, at a groom who let a horse loose near the children's garden, and even then it had been less a shout than a stone dropped in a well, a single hard word, and then the awful, waiting silence of a man who did not need to say more. He was not a large man. That surprises people who only know the story. They imagine someone the size of a door. Locke was lean, dry, weathered like a fence post, with pale eyes that seemed always to be reading the small print of the world. He had served the late Queen Isolde for 11 years before she died. He had served the king for 9 more after. He knew the law of the house the way a priest knows scripture, not as a set of rules he obeyed, but as the bones under everything, the thing that held the body up. The investiture of the Ashwater is not a coronation. I want that clear from the start because the whole of what happened turns on it. A coronation makes a sovereign. The Ashwater makes nothing. It only names what already is. It is an old rite, older than the current line, and its whole purpose is to place upon the head of the rightful heir of the first blood a plain circlet, the Ashwater diadem, a thin band of pale silver with a single gray stone, worth less by weight than the buttons on my tunic, as a public witnessing that the line runs true. It is done once in a reign, and it is done for the eldest child of the sovereign's first marriage, the child of the first crowned queen. In our house, that was Princess Ilara. Only Ilara. The rite has exactly one seat at its center, and the law that governs it is not a matter of taste or favor or the king's affection. It is a matter of blood and record, witnessed by the herald of the house, whose ledger is the oldest continuous document in the kingdom. Queen Consort Morwenna was not of the first blood. She was the king's second wife, married after Isolde died, and by every law of the house she stood beside the throne but never on it. Her own children, Lord Cassius and Lady Verena, were of the king's blood but not of the first marriage, and so the Ashwater was closed to them as surely as a locked door. Morwenna knew this. Everyone knew this. It was not obscure. It was written in the order of ceremony that had gone out to every soul in the hall 3 weeks before, on heavy cream paper in the herald's own hand. The Ashwater diadem to be born to the Princess Ilara, firstborn of the first queen, and to no other. To no other. 4 words. I would come to think of them as the 4 most important words in the kingdom. That morning the Hall of Vows was full. It is a long, high room, all gray stone and tall windows, with a stepped dais at the east end and the great ledger stand beside it, and it holds perhaps 400 when it is packed, which it was. There were the great families in their best. There was the Princess Adela, the king's sister, seated near the front with her back straight as a rifle and her face giving nothing away, which was her manner. There were the children, young Torin and Malin and little Bram, scrubbed and fidgeting in the second row under the eye of a nurse. There was Crown Prince Rowan, grave and pale. There were bishops and old soldiers and the whole apparatus of the house. And at the center of it, on a low chair 1 step below the dais, sat the Princess Ilara herself in a dress the color of ash and pearl, waiting to be named what she already was. And there was the king. I should tell you about the king, because the king is the hinge of it. Alaric was old by then and had been unwell through the winter, and though he sat upon the great chair at the top of the dais, he sat the way old kings sit when the weight has become mostly memory. His hands trembled on the arms of the chair. His eyes were clear enough, but they were tired, and grief had worn deep channels in him, for Isolde still, after all these years, and for the strength that was leaving him one season at a time. He loved Morwenna. That is a thing people forget or refuse to believe because of how the story ends. But he did. She had been kind to him in the manner she chose to be kind, which was to make his loneliness comfortable, and a lonely old king will forgive a great deal in exchange for the feeling of not being alone. It was that love and that tiredness that Morwenna had spent the winter counting on. The rite began as rites do. The herald rose Master Corwin, a narrow, dry old man with a voice like a page turning, and read the opening declarations, and the bishops said their words, and the light came slantwise through the eastern windows and lay in long gold bars across the stone. I stood my post at the foot of the dais steps on the left, with Locke 3 paces to my right at the corner where the cordon turned. We were not there for show. There is always a real guard beneath the ceremonial one. The plumes and the polish sit on top of men who are genuinely watching the room. Locke was watching the room. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved and did not rest. Something in him was already unquiet, and I did not yet know why, and I would spend a long time afterward wondering how much he had guessed before the doors ever opened. Then the western doors opened. They were not supposed to open. The order of ceremony had every soul already seated. The western doors, the great processional doors, were to stay shut until the rite was done and the recessional began. So when the two of them swung inward with a low groan of old hinges, 400 heads turned at once, and the reading faltered, and Master Corwin's dry voice trailed into nothing. Into the gap of that silence walked Queen Consort Morwenna. She came slowly, which was the point. She wanted to be seen. She wore a gown of deep wine-dark silk, and a mantle of the house trimmed in white fur that swept the stone behind her, and jewels at her throat that caught the window-light and threw it about the room like sparks. But it was not the gown that made the whole hall draw its breath in one long, ragged pull. It was what sat upon her head. It was a crown, not the little gray Ashwater diadem that still lay on its cushion of dark velvet on the ledger stand, waiting for Alara. This was the other one. The consort's diadem she was entitled to, yes, but she had not stopped at that. Set above it, wound into her dark hair, was the pale silver arch of the first queen's own coronet, Isolde's coronet, the emblem of the first crowned queen, which had lain in the sealed treasury under the herald's seal since the day Isolde died. It was not hers. It could never be hers. It belonged to the office of the first queen, and after her to the first queen's line, which is to say, to Alara, and to no one living but Alara. Morwenna had taken it out of the sealed treasury, and she had put it on her own head, and she had walked into the one rite in the kingdom, whose entire purpose was to declare that the first blood ran true through Alara and through no other. And she had come to sit in the center of it, wearing the dead queen's crown, and dare the whole house to stop her. I did not understand all of that in the moment. I understood only that the room had gone wrong. I understood it the way you understand that a floor is not level before you can say why, a lurch in the gut, a sense of the world tilting. Beside me, I heard Locke breathe out, very slowly, through his nose, and I glanced at him and saw that his face had not changed at all, and that this was the most frightening thing I had ever seen, because a man whose face does not change when the world tilts is a man who already knows exactly what he is going to do. Morwenna crossed the hall. Nobody stopped her. That is the part that shames us all still, and it shames me most of all, because I was one of the men whose whole purpose was to be the thing that stopped wrongs from crossing that floor. And I did not move, because no order had been given, and no one senior to me had so much as breathed, and I was 23 and green, and I did not yet know that there are moments when the absence of an order is itself the wrong. She walked up the aisle between the great families and their turning, frozen faces, and the fur of her mantle hissed across the stone, and she came to the low chair one step below the dais, Alara's chair, the seat at the center of the rite, and she did not sit in it. She went past it. She climbed the 2 steps to the dais itself, to the empty place that had been left beside the king's great chair, and she turned, and she settled herself there beside her husband in the full sight of 400 people, crowned with a dead woman's crown, at the center of a rite that existed to say the crown was not hers. And the king, I watched him, I watched his old face. The king looked up at her, and his trembling hand half rose from the arm of the chair, and his mouth opened, and no sound came out of it. He was surprised. I am as sure of that as I am of anything. He had not known she would do this. But he was old, and he was tired, and he loved her, and in the space of 2 heartbeats I watched him decide, the way tired old men decide, to let it be, to swallow it, to smooth it over, to not make a scene at his daughter's rite. And his hand came back down to the arm of the chair, and he said nothing, and by saying nothing he let the wrong sit down beside the throne. That, I think now, was the true crisis of the day, not Morwenna's boldness, the king's silence. Because when the king says nothing, the house has no voice. Master Corwin, the herald, stood frozen at his stand with the ledger open before him and his old hands gripping the edges of it, and I could see him warring with himself. The record said one thing and the throne said nothing, and a herald is a keeper of the record, but he is not a sovereign. He cannot command. He can only witness. Princess Adela had half risen from her seat in the front row, her face gone white and hard, and I saw her look to the king, and I saw the king not look back, and I saw her sink slowly down again with her jaw set like a trap, because even the king's own sister will not overrule the king in open court unless she is prepared to break the house in 2 to do it. Crown Prince Rowan had gone the color of the stone behind him, and Alara sat in her ashen pearl gown 1 step below the dais, in the chair that was hers, looking up at the woman who had taken her mother's crown and sat down in the light that was meant for her, and she did not weep, and she did not cry out, and something about the straightness of her back and the stillness of her hands was worse than any weeping could have been. 400 people, and not one of them moved. I have thought about that stillness for many years. It was not cowardice exactly. It was the terrible good manners of powerful people, the deep-trained instinct that says the worst thing that can happen in a great room is a scene, that a wrong quietly swallowed is always to be preferred to a right loudly insisted upon. Every soul in that hall could see the wrong. Every soul could feel the floor tilting. And every soul had decided, in the private arithmetic of their own advancement, that it was not their place to be the one to speak, and that the king's silence gave them leave to keep their own. The wrong was going to win. It was going to win the way most wrongs win, not by force, but by consensus, by 400 well-bred people agreeing not to see it. In another minute Master Corwin would have gathered himself and read on, and the rite would have been completed with the usurper crowned and enthroned above the true heir, and it would have become, by the mere fact of having happened without objection, a thing that had been allowed, a precedent, a stone laid in the foundation of a lie. And then Sergeant Gethin Locke, 3rd man from me on the inner cordon, took 1 step forward off his post. You must understand what that step was. A guardsman does not leave his post. It is the first thing they beat into you and the last thing they trust you to have kept. The post is not a place, it is a promise. You may be spat on at your post, mocked, jostled, filmed. You hold. You may see a friend fall ill in the crowd and you do not go to him, because someone else will go and your leaving would be a hole in the wall. To step off the cordon during a rite in open court, unbidden, was a thing so far outside the shape of our lives that when Locke did it my first thought was not he is doing something brave but a stupid animal panic. He has made a mistake. He will be broken for this. Someone stop him, as though he had stumbled, as though it were an accident of the feet. It was not an accident. He moved the way he did everything, without hurry and without doubt, 1 boot and then the other on the gray stone, and the small, precise sound of his heels in the huge silence turned every head in the hall a second time. He did not go to the king. He did not go to Morwenna. He went to the ledger stand to Master Corwin the herald, and he stopped before it and he said, in a voice pitched low but carrying, a voice trained on a parade ground to reach the back of a formation without ever seeming to shout, "Master Herald, I ask the record." The whole hall heard it. I ask the record. It is an old form. Most in that room had never heard it spoken aloud, because it belongs to a part of the house law that had not needed to be invoked in living memory. It is the right of any sworn man of the house, any guardsman, any officer of the ledger, any servant who has taken the oath, to require the herald in open court to read from the record the law that governs the moment at hand. It is not a challenge to the sovereign. That is the whole cunning of it, the thing Locke had reached for in the 2 heartbeats while the rest of us stood frozen. It does not oppose the king. It does not accuse anyone. It only asks the herald to do the one thing the herald exists to do, to read the record aloud, and once the record is read aloud in open court, it binds. Not by anyone's will, by its own nature. A thing spoken into the record cannot be unheard. Master Corwin looked at him. I saw the old man's throat move as he swallowed. He looked for one long moment to the king, because a herald's instinct is always to the throne, and the king's tired eyes were on Locke now, and the king said nothing, and I understood later that the king's silence, which had been the instrument of the wrong, became in that instant the instrument of its undoing, because the herald, receiving no command to be silent, was free to obey the law instead. Corwin drew a breath. His old hand steadied on the ledger, and he said, "The record is asked." "The record answers." Morwenna moved then. Up on the dais beside the king, she leaned forward, and the dead queen's crown caught the light and threw it, and she said, sharp, bright, imperious, a voice built to end conversations, "Sit down, sergeant. This is a rite, not a barracks. You forget yourself." And Locke, without turning to her, without raising his eyes to the dais at all, said the sentence I have carried with me for the rest of my life. He said, "I forget nothing, your grace. That is my whole trade." I have heard grander lines in plays. I have heard clever ones. I have never heard one that landed the way that one landed in that stone room, because it was not a boast and it was not a defiance. It was simply exactly true, and everyone in the hall knew it was true, and the truth of it went through the room like cold water. A guardsman's trade is to remember. To remember the post, the oath, the order of things, the 4 words on the cream paper. Morwenna's whole scheme depended on everyone in the room agreeing to forget, for just 5 minutes, what they all knew. And here was a lean, weathered man 3 paces off his post saying, without heat, that forgetting was the one thing he had sworn never to do. She sat back just slightly. I saw it. She was recalculating. "Read the record, Master Herald," Locke said. "Read the order of the Ashwater. Read whose crown that is." Now the hall was so silent I could hear the tallow of the great candles hissing on the dais. Corwin bent over the ledger. His finger found the place. He did not need to search. He had known it before he was asked, but a herald reads with his finger on the line so that all can see he reads and does not invent, and he began. "By the law of the house," Corwin read, and his dry old voice had steadied into the flat, deliberate cadence of a man reading a thing that has been true for 400 years and will be true for 400 more. "The Ashwater is born to the firstborn of the first-crowned queen, and to no other. The Ashwater diadem passes to that heir, and the coronet of the first queen," and here his voice did not falter but it slowed, each word set down like a stone. "The coronet of the first queen passes, upon her death, into the keeping of the house under the herald's seal, and thence to that same heir, and to no living person besides. It is not the consort's. It is not the second wife's. It is not the king's to give nor any man's to bear. The coronet of the first queen belongs to the first queen's line. So it is written. So it has always been written." He lifted his eyes from the page. "The crown her grace wears," Master Corwin said, and now he was not reading, now he was witnessing, which is a herald's other and graver office. is the coronet of the late Queen Isolde. It was drawn from the sealed treasury under my seal, which seal I did not break and did not authorize to be broken. By the record, it belongs to the Princess Ilara. By the record, it belongs to no one else. That is the answer of the record. And there it was, out in the open air of the hall, spoken into being, unable ever to be unheard. I want to tell you the room erupted. It did not. That is not how great rooms full of powerful people work. What happened was worse and better than an eruption. A long, low, rolling murmur, 400 people breathing out at once and beginning, in 100 small voices, to say to one another the thing they had all seen and all agreed not to see, now that a herald had made it sayable. Heads turned. Fans stopped. Lord this and lady that leaned to one another. And up on the dais, beside her stricken husband, Queen Consort Morwenna's face, which had been all cool imperious command, began, for the first time, to show the thing underneath it, which was not shame. I watched her closely, and I will tell you it was not shame. It was calculation curdling into something harder. She had gambled that no one would dare. She had been wrong by exactly one man, and now the record was read, and she could not unring that bell, and so she did the thing that people like her always do when the quiet way has failed them. She reached for force. "You have read your record," she said, and her voice had climbed and thinned. She rose from the seat beside the king, and she was magnificent and terrible, the wine-dark silk and the white fur and the stolen silver, and she stood at the top of the dais and looked down the length of the hall at the lean man at the ledger stand. "And now I will read you mine. I am the queen of this house. I sit beside the king, who is my husband and your sovereign, and who has not spoken one word against me. You are a sergeant of the guard. You will return to your post, and you will hold your tongue, or I will have you stripped of that tunic before the sun is down and turned out of the only gate you have ever been fit to stand at. Do you hear me, sergeant? The king has not spoken. Until the king speaks against me, there is no wrong here. There is only a soldier who has forgotten his place." It was, I have to admit, well aimed. She had found the one seam in the thing Locke had built. He had summoned the record, and the record had answered, but the record only witnesses. It does not act. Someone must act. And the only person with the standing to act, the king, sat gray and silent and grieving in the great chair, unable or unwilling to move against the wife he loved. And as long as he sat silent, Morwenna's argument had a horrible logic to it. There is only a soldier who has forgotten his place. The murmur died away. The hall waited. I could feel 400 people, and myself among them, turn like a single creature to look at the king, to beg him, silently, to speak, to lift the weight from all of us, to be the sovereign the moment demanded. And King Alaric looked out at the room, at his daughter in her ashen pearl gown, at his sister with her white hard face, at his grave son, at the lean sergeant who had stepped off his post, and he opened his mouth, and I saw his old eyes fill, and I saw him try. I saw the effort of it move across his whole face like a man trying to lift a stone too heavy for him, and the word did not come. He was too tired. He was too grieving. He loved her too much, and he was too old, and the winter had taken too much out of him, and the plain, hard word that would have ended it, no, would not come up out of him, and his mouth closed again, and a tear ran down into the deep channel beside it, and he said nothing. The king would not save us. And Morwenna, seeing it, drew herself up taller, and I saw the hard triumph come back into her, because she believed, as she had always believed, as her whole scheme was built to believe, that in the absence of the king's word, hers was the only word that counted. She had made one error. She had thought the choice in that hall lay between the king's word and her word. Sergeant Locke was about to show her that there was a third word, older than either, and that he had come there to speak it. He turned at last to face the dais, not to the king, to Morwenna. And he did the thing that made the whole hall gasp aloud, the thing that people who tell this story badly always put at the very center as though it were a moment of drama for its own sake, when in truth it was the most careful, most lawful, most deliberate act I have ever watched a man perform. He walked forward. He crossed the open floor at the foot of the dais, and he climbed the first step, and the second, and Morwenna's guards. She had brought 2 of her own household men, big fellows in her livery, and they stood at the corners of the dais, took a half step in, and Locke did not so much as glance at them, and something in the way he did not glance at them made them stop where they were. And he came to stand before Queen Consort Morwenna, close enough to reach her, and he inclined his head, not a bow exactly, but the grave dip of a man acknowledging a person's rank while denying their claim, and he spoke. "Your Grace," he said, "you have named the king's silence as your warrant, but the king's silence is not a law of the house. It is the absence of one. And where the king is silent, the house is not without a voice, because before there was a king to command us, there was an oath that bound us, and that oath does not fall silent when the king is tired." He let that sit. Then, "I am a sworn man of the house. On the day I took the tunic I swore, every one of us swore to keep the person and the property and the honor of the house, and to suffer no man and no woman, however high, to bear away by force or fraud that which the record says is not theirs. That is not the king's oath to me. That is my oath to the house, sworn before the herald, entered in the record. It binds me whether the king speaks or not. It binds me especially when the king cannot." I saw Master Corwin's head come up sharply, because Locke had just said something the herald knew to be exactly, technically true, and had said it in the one form that made it binding, entered in the record, sworn before the herald. Every man of the guard had indeed sworn that oath. Most of us thought of it, if we thought of it at all, as a fine old form of words, the sort of thing you mumble on your first day and never think about again. Locke had never stopped thinking about it. He had, I would learn, carried the exact words of it folded in the breast of his tunic for 20 years, on a square of paper gone soft as cloth, and he had read them the way other men read a letter from someone they loved. "The coronet you wear," Locke said, "is not yours. The record has said so in open court before the herald and 400 witnesses. You bear it away by, I will not say fraud, your grace, before the king. I will say only that you bear it without right, and that the record says you bear it without right, and that I am sworn to suffer no one, however high, to do so. I am not disobeying the king. The king has given no order. I am obeying the oath the king himself received from me on the day he watched me take the tunic, and so," he straightened. His pale eyes came up to hers and held them, and his voice, if anything, dropped lower, gentler, which was somehow more terrible than a shout. "And so I must ask you, your grace, to give up the crown. Take it from your head and set it in the herald's keeping, and this ends here quietly, and no more need be said of it. I ask you plainly, and I ask you first, because that is the honorable way, and because I would spare the king the sight of anything worse." The hall did not breathe. Morwenna looked at him, and then she laughed. It was a short, disbelieving, silver laugh, the laugh of a woman who has spent her whole life discovering that the rules bend for her, and who cannot, in the deepest part of herself, believe that this lean, weathered nobody genuinely intends to stand in front of the world and refuse to bend. "You must ask me to give up the crown," she repeated, tasting the absurdity of it. "A sergeant, a doorman." She turned, half to the hall, playing to it, sure of it. "You have all heard him. He threatens the queen at the Ashwater. He lays out his little oath and his little record as though a scrap of old ink outweighs the living throne. My lords, Lord Havern, will no one see this man removed?" And here is where it should have ended for Locke, and where, for a long and dreadful stretch of minutes, it very nearly did. Because a man rose. Lord Havern, a heavy, florid man of the second families, one of Morwenna's creatures, a man who had grown fat on her patronage and knew which side of the room his bread was buttered, rose from his seat near the front. And he was not alone. 2 or 3 others rose with him, and they came out into the aisle, and there was suddenly the shape of a mob about it, the ugly readiness of men who have been given permission to be brutal in a good cause. "The Queen has spoken," Havern said, loud, blustering, covering his own uncertainty with volume. Guards her guards, the household men, take him out. This is a disgrace, this is treason at the Ashwater of all places, take him and let the king's right go on. And Morwenna's two big household men, who had been waiting for exactly this, for the cover of a lord's command, came off the corners of the dais toward Locke. This was the false dawn, though it was a dark one the moment when it looked, to every eye in that hall including mine, as though the wrong was going to win after all and win uglier than before, because now it would win by having the one honest man in the room dragged out by the collar while the record he had summoned lay open and ignored on its stand. I felt it in my own body, the certainty of it. The king silent, a lord commanding, two large men closing. And Locke alone on the steps of the dais, unarmored beneath his tunic, a lean man of middle years against the whole gathered weight of the powerful, holding nothing but an oath and a scrap of soft paper. I did the only thing I could think to do, which was small and probably foolish and which I have never regretted. I stepped off my own post. I came off the cordon and I crossed the floor and I placed myself at the foot of the dais steps below my sergeant, facing out, facing the two household men and Lord Havern and the whole muttering room, and I put my hand, I did not draw, we do not draw, but I put my hand to rest on the hilt at my belt, and I said, in a voice that shook more than I wanted it to, "The sergeant has asked the record, and the record has answered. No man lays hands on a sworn man of the house while he keeps the record, not by a lord's word, only by the king's." I was 23 and I did not fully know what I was saying, only that it was true, and that it was the same true thing Locke had been saying, dressed in my own smaller courage. And it stopped them. For one heartbeat, too, the two household men checked, because now it was not one lean sergeant but two guardsmen and an invoked record and the whole terrible weight of the oath. And household bullies in a lady's livery are not, in the end, sworn men of the house, and some old dread of touching one who keeps the record went through them and rooted their boots to the stone. But Lord Havern was made of coarser stuff, and he was frightened now, which made him dangerous. "Two of them," he sneered, "two little doormen who have lost their heads. The Queen commands. I command in her name. Are there no loyal men in this hall? Take them both out, and we'll have the Ashwater done and these two whipped by supper. Move." And more of Morwenna's people rose, and the household men came on again, emboldened, and I felt a hand close on my shoulder from behind and begin to wrench me around. And I heard, at the very edge of things, little Bram begin to cry in the second row, that thin, high, frightened sound of a small child who does not understand what the grown people are doing but knows it has gone wrong. And the sound of that crying, I have always believed, is what finally moved the room, not the record, not the oath. A frightened child, weeping in a stone hall, because the adults sworn to keep the house had begun to brawl at the foot of the throne. Into that the hands on me, the household men on Locke, the lord bellowing, the child crying, the king frozen and weeping in his great chair, a voice cut like a blade drawn clean from a scabbard. A woman's voice, hard and cold and absolutely without fear, a voice that had commanded parade grounds and hospital wards and quarreling generals, and had never once in its life been ignored. "Stop it." Princess Adela was on her feet. She was not a young woman, the king's sister, but she stood like a young woman, like a soldier, which in her heart she had always been, having spent 40 years wishing she had been born the brother instead of the sister, and making up for it by being harder than any brother could have managed. She came out into the aisle. She did not raise her voice again. She did not need to. The one word had done its work, and the household men had frozen, and the hand on my shoulder had loosened, and Lord Havern's bluster had died in his throat, because there are people in the world whose displeasure is a physical weather, and Adela was one of them, and she had turned it on the whole hall at once. "Sit down, Havern," she said without looking at him, and he sat, folding down into his seat like a tent with the pole pulled out. "You household men, off the dais, now." And they went backing away from Locke, back to their corners, their eyes down. She walked up the aisle into the open floor, and she came to stand beside Locke and me at the foot of the steps, and she turned to face the dais and the king and the crowned consort. And for the first time all morning, the center of the hall held someone with both the standing and the will to act. "My brother is unwell," she said. Her voice was pitched to carry, and it was terrible in its plainness, because she was saying aloud the thing everyone had been too polite to say. "He is old and he grieves, and this winter has taken the strength out of him, and every soul in this hall can see it, and every soul in this hall has spent the last 10 minutes hiding behind it. His silence is not consent. His silence is a sick man's silence, and you have all been content to treat it as a decree because a decree suited your comfort. I will not." She let her eyes move slowly across the great families, one row at a time, and I watched grown lords find things to look at on the floor. "You, all of you, you saw the crown, you knew the crown. You had the order of ceremony in your own hands 3 weeks ago to the Princess Ilara, and to no other. You read it over your breakfast and you thought nothing of it. And then this woman walked in wearing my dead sister-in-law's coronet on her head, and you sat on your hands because you were afraid of a scene. A sergeant of the door had more house in him than the whole front of this hall. Be ashamed. Every one of you. Be ashamed." No one spoke. The shame in the room was a physical thing, thick as smoke. Then Adela turned to Morwenna, and the two women looked at each other across the width of the dais, and there was between them the long, cold history of two people who had disliked each other for years with perfect courtesy, and were now, at last, done with the courtesy. "You have miscalculated, Morwenna," Adela said. "You thought the danger was that my brother would say no, so you arranged that he would be too weak to say it, and you counted on the rest of them being too well-mannered to say it for him, and you were nearly right. You were right about the lords. You were right about the bishops. You were nearly right about me. God forgive me, because I very nearly sat still too, out of the same wretched fear of breaking the house in open court." Her jaw tightened. "But you forgot the guard. You forgot that there is a kind of man whose whole life is arranged around the one thing you cannot buy or frighten or wait out. The man who has decided, once and for all and long before the test comes, that he would rather lose the tunic than break the oath. And you walked your scheme straight past him. That was your error, not greed, not boldness. You underestimated a doorman." "He is a servant," Morwenna said, but the imperious ring had gone out of it now. She was fighting, and she knew she was fighting. "A servant does not remove a crown from the head of a queen. There is no world in which that is anything but assault. Touch me, sergeant, and it is not the tunic you lose, it is your liberty. I will have you in a cell before the candles gutter, and this princess and this boy who fancies himself a hero will visit you there. You dare not touch the queen. You dare not." And she was, in the narrowest legal sense, correct. And Locke knew she was correct. And this is the part of the story that separates it from 100 lesser tales of a good man doing a bold thing. Because a bold man, a lesser man, would have simply reached up and taken the crown, and been right in his heart and wrong in the law, and given Morwenna exactly the assault she was daring him to commit, the servant who laid hands on the queen, and she would have twisted the whole day into a story about a mad guardsman who attacked the sovereign's wife at a sacred rite, and the record would have been buried under it. Locke did not reach for the crown. He had never intended to reach for the crown by his own hand. That was never the plan. The plan, and I did not understand until this moment that there had been a plan, that the lean man had walked into that hall with the whole thing already built in his head, step by lawful step. The plan was something colder and cleaner and far harder to do. "You are right, your grace," Locke said. "A servant may not lay hands on the queen. I will not lay a hand on you. I have not, and I will not." He turned, and he looked at Master Corwin the herald, and he said the words that were the true keystone of the whole arch he had been building since the western doors first groaned open. "But the coronet you wear is not the queen's. The record has said so. It is the property of the house, held under the herald's seal, and it has been drawn from its keeping without the breaking of that seal by any authorized hand, which is to say, it has been taken, removed from the sealed treasury. That is not a matter of ceremony, your grace. That is a matter of the house's keeping, and the keeping of the house's property from those who take it without right is the plainest, oldest, least deniable part of my oath and of my duty. I do not remove a crown from a queen. I recover stolen property of the house. And that, Master Herald, his pale eyes never left Corwin's, is a thing a sworn man not only may do, but must do, and requires no order of the king to do it, and no queen's leave, and it is no assault in any law that has ever governed this house. I ask you to witness it. Property of the house, taken from sealed keeping without right in open court before 400 souls. Do you witness it? Master Corwin the herald looked down at his ledger. He looked at the open page at the 400-year-old law under his own finger. He looked at the king one last time, and the king, I will swear to this until I die, the king, unable to speak, unable to lift the weight of the word himself, met his sister's eyes and then met the herald's, and gave with his trembling old head the smallest nod a man has ever given. Not a command. He could not manage a command, but leave. The king gave his leave, in the only currency he had left, a half-inch of movement in a grieving old neck, and the herald saw it, and I saw it, and the whole front of the hall saw it, and it was enough. I witness it, said Master Corwin. The coronet of the late Queen Isolde has been taken from sealed keeping without right, and is worn in open court by one who has no title to it. By the law of the house, it is to be recovered into the herald's keeping. Sergeant, you are a sworn man of the house before this record and this court. Recover the property of the house. And now it was lawful. Now it was not a servant defying a queen. It was a sworn man recovering the property of the house at the witnessed instruction of the herald in open court, with the king's leave given and the record read and everything, done in the exact right order so that no man alive could ever afterward twist it into anything but what it was. This is what people miss when they tell the story short. They think the drama was in the reaching up. It was not. The drama was in the 20 minutes of lawful scaffolding Locke had raised, plank by plank, in front of 400 hostile or frightened people, so that, when the moment came to actually touch the crown, it was already the most correct thing that had ever been done in that room, and could not be undone. Locke turned back to Morwenna. He climbed the last step, so that he stood level with her on the dais, and he inclined his head again, that grave, particular dip, the honor to the person and the denial of the false claim, both at once, and he spoke to her one last time, and this time his voice was not for the hall. It was low, and it was for her, and it was almost gentle. Your Grace, I will ask you a last time so that it may be your own hand and not mine, because even now I would spare you that. Take the coronet from your head and give it to the herald, and let this be a thing you did rather than a thing that was done to you. I am going to recover it either way. The record has spoken and the herald has instructed, and I am sworn and I will not fail, but it can still be your choice. Choose it. For a moment, one long moment, I thought she might. I saw something flicker behind the hard, bright surface of her, some old calculation of dignity, some understanding that a queen who surrenders a crown with her own hands keeps something a queen whose crown is lifted from her loses forever. Her fingers rose halfway to the silver. The whole hall watched her fingers. And then the calculation went the other way, as it always did with her, toward defiance, toward the gamble, toward the belief that had ruled her whole life, that if she simply refused hard enough the world would blink. She dropped her hand. She lifted her chin. No, she said, you will not dare, in front of the king, in front of the house. You will not dare. I am sorry, Your Grace, Locke said. And he raised his hands. I have seen men do violent things. I have seen a great deal of force in my years on the wall, and force has a look to it, a jaggedness, a heat. There was none of that in what Locke did. He reached up with both white-gloved hands slowly, giving her every last instant to move, and he did not touch her head, and he did not touch her hair, and he did not touch her face. He touched only the silver. He closed his gloved fingers around the arch of the late Queen Isolde's coronet, at the 2 points where the metal rose clear of her dark hair, and he lifted it straight up, level, careful as a man lifting a sleeping child, careful as a man handling something holy, which in a sense he was up and clear and away from her head, and he held it up for one instant in the long gold bars of the eastern light, so that every soul in the hall could see plainly what it was, and that it was whole and unharmed. And then he brought it down against his chest and turned and carried it in both hands down the steps of the dais to the ledger stand, and set it upon the dark velvet cushion where the little gray Ashwater diadem already lay, and stepped back and stood and bowed his head. The consort's diadem, the one that was genuinely hers, that she had every right to wear, Locke did not touch at all. It remained upon her head. That too was the law, and the law was exact, and Locke was exact. He took only what was not hers. He left her everything that was. And that precision, that refusal to take one grain more than the record allowed even in the moment of his triumph, is the reason the whole house came in the end to speak of Gethin Locke, not as the sergeant who humiliated a queen, but as the man who, at the one moment when he held all the power in the room, used exactly as much of it as the law required, and not one atom more. Morwenna stood on the dais with the wine-dark silk and the white fur and the diadem that was truly hers, and no dead queen's crown, and for the length of 3 heartbeats she was silent, and then she understood, you could see it cross her face, the full weight of it arriving, that she had lost, and that she had lost publicly, and that there was no version of the story anyone could tell afterward in which she had not been shown before 400 witnesses and the open record. To have worn a crown that was not hers, and had it lawfully and gently taken from her by a doorman while the king wept and did nothing to stop it. She had come to the Ashwater to be seen. She had been seen. "You have made an enemy today," she said to Locke low, and it was the truest thing she said all morning, and Locke answered it in the only way the moment allowed. "No, your grace," he said, "I have kept the record. The record makes no enemies. It only remembers." And he returned to the ledger stand, and he stood beside the recovered crown, and he did not look at her again. It was Adela who ended it, because someone withstanding had to, and the king could not. She turned to Master Corwin. "Master Harold," she said, "the rite was interrupted. It is not finished. My brother is unwell and cannot lead it to its close, and so I ask you, as the king's sister in the king's sight, with the king's leave, to complete it as the law provides." She looked at the king. The king, weeping still but calmer now, the terrible weight lifted from him by other hands than his own, gave again his half-inch of a nod. And Adela crossed the floor to the low chair one step below the dais, where Princess Alara had sat this whole time in her ashen pearl gown, straight-backed and dry-eyed and silent through every minute of it, and she held out her hand to her niece. "Come, child," said Adela, the only person in the house who could call the grown Princess child and mean it as the highest tenderness. "You have waited long enough, longer than any of them deserve to make you wait. Come and be witnessed as what you have always been." And Alara rose and took her aunt's hand, and came to the center of the rite that had always been hers. Master Corwin lifted the little gray Ashwater diadem from its cushion, the plain silver band, the single dull stone, the least valuable thing in that whole jeweled hall, and the only crown in it that morning worn by rite, and Alara knelt on the low step, and the herald read the old words of the witnessing, the words that make nothing and only name what already is. "Firstborn of the first crowned queen of the first blood, true in the line, so witnessed, so recorded, so it has always been and so it remains." And he set the plain gray circlet on her dark head, and she rose and turned and faced the hall, the true heir, the true line, plainly crowned with the plain crown, and the 400 came at last to their feet, all of them, even Lord Havern. Even the bishops who had sat frozen, even the great families who had hidden behind the king's silence, because a room full of people who have just been shamed will always overcorrect into loud approval, and their applause was as much apology as it was homage. But it was homage too. And I saw Alara look over all their heads, past the clapping lords and the weeping king and her furious aunt, to the lean, weathered man standing quiet beside the ledger stand with his head bowed and the recovered crown safe behind him. And I saw her incline her head to Sergeant Locke, just slightly, just once. And I saw him meet her eyes and return it. And that small exchange over the heads of 400 grander people was the true coronation of the day. Morwenna did not stay to see the end of it. Somewhere in the applause she gathered her wine-dark silk and her white fur and her genuine, lawful, unstolen little diadem, and she went out the way she had come, through the western doors alone, and if anyone watched her go I was not among them, because I was watching the princess, and I have never once regretted the choice of what to watch. That is the whole of what happened in the Hall of Vows. But it is not the whole of the story, because a thing like that does not end when the doors close, and because I have never been able to tell it honestly without telling the two halves I did not understand that morning. The half about how the crime was done, which came out in the weeks after, and the half about the man, Locke, which I only came to understand years later, and which is, in the end, the part I most want you to carry away. The scheme first, because it is the smaller thing. Morwenna had not acted on a whim. The taking of the crown had been months in the planning, and the planning was clever, and it very nearly worked. It would have worked, but for one man, and understanding how close it came is the only way to understand how much that one man's stillness was worth. She had begun the winter before, when the king first sickened, by making herself indispensable to his comfort, and through his comfort, to the running of the household. A weak king does not stop being obeyed. His power simply flows to whoever stands nearest and speaks most confidently in his name, and Morwenna had made very sure to be that person. She controlled who saw him and when. She softened every hard question before it reached him. And in the quiet of that winter she had turned her attention to the sealed treasury and the late queen's coronet, because she understood. She was not a stupid woman. She was a very intelligent woman bent entirely to a bad purpose. That the coronet was the one object in the kingdom that could be made to say the thing she wanted said. Crowns are arguments. Whoever wears the first queen's crown makes, by wearing it, a wordless claim to the first queen's place and the first queen's line. Morwenna wanted that place for herself and that line for her own children, for Cassius and Verena, and she had understood that the way to seize it was not through papers, which could be contested, but through a single overwhelming public image. The consort, crowned as the first queen, enthroned at the Ashwater above the true heir, unchallenged, an image that, once it existed and was witnessed and passed without objection, would become its own kind of law, a precedent no later paper could quite erase. She had needed three things. She had needed the king too weak to say no, and the winter had given her that. She had needed the crown out of its sealed keeping, and here she had done the one genuinely criminal thing, the thing that later cost her most, because she had suborned the underkeeper of the treasury, a frightened, indebted man named Perrin, and had him draw the coronet from its case in the dead of night and bring it to her, unrecorded, the seal left seemingly intact by a trick of wax that Perrin had learned, and that Master Corwin's people would later discover and document in humiliating detail. And she had needed the house to be too well-mannered to make a scene, and here she had counted on the deepest, truest thing she knew about powerful people, which is that they will swallow almost any wrong rather than be the one to disturb the smooth surface of a great occasion. Three things. She had all three. She had the king's weakness, the stolen crown, and the certain cowardice of the room. Her arithmetic was correct in every particular. She had simply not put a doorman in the sum. Because the one variable she could not see, standing invisible in his red tunic at the corner of the cordon, was a man for whom the smooth surface of the occasion meant nothing at all, and the record meant everything, and who had decided some 20 years before, on the day he first read the oath and did not stop reading it, that he was the kind of man who would rather be turned out of every gate in the kingdom than stand at his post and watch the record broken and hold his tongue. You cannot plan around that man, because that man does not appear in the calculations of people like Morwenna. He is to them furniture, a fixture, a part of the wall, And the great secret of the whole story, the thing I have spent my life trying to make people understand, is that the wall was never furniture. The wall was watching. The wall had read the record. The wall was only waiting, all along, for someone to make it necessary to move. In the days after the Ashwater, the story did what stories do in a palace. It ran through the corridors faster than any messenger, growing and shrinking and changing shape in the telling. By the second day there were 3 versions abroad: that a mad guardsman had assaulted the queen at a sacred rite, that a heroic guardsman had single-handedly overthrown a usurper. And quietly, among the older servants who actually knew the house law, the true version, which was less dramatic than either and far more solid: that a sworn man had asked the record, and the record had answered, and the property of the house had been recovered by the book, in the right order, with the right witnesses, in a way that could never be undone. It was the third version that mattered, because it was the third version that Master Corwin wrote into the ledger, in his narrow hand, on the page that follows the page of the Ashwater itself, and the ledger does not care which version is exciting. The ledger only records what is true. Morwenna moved fast, as I knew she would, because a cornered schemer's first instinct is always to change the subject to the sins of whoever cornered her. Within a day she had gone to the king. She still had access to the king. The winter had not changed that yet, and she had wept and stormed and demanded that Sergeant Locke be arrested for assault upon the person of the queen, and stripped of his tunic, and made an example of, so that no doorman should ever again dream of laying hands upon his betters. And the king, weak and grieving and torn, might even have done it, out of sheer exhaustion, to make the weeping stop, except that this was the one thing the whole lawful architecture of Locke's stand had been built to prevent, and it held, exactly as he had built it to hold. Because when the king, harried and unwell, put the question to Master Corwin, "Did the sergeant assault my wife?" the herald had only to open the ledger and read what was written there, in the record that binds. And the record said, the coronet worn was the property of the house, taken from sealed keeping without rite. The record was asked in open court and answered. The herald witnessed the taking and instructed the recovery. The sergeant recovered the property of the house at the herald's witnessed instruction and touched the person of no one. There was no assault, because there was no crown of the queen's upon her head to defend, only property of the house upon the head of one who had taken it. There it all was, written down before it could be argued away. The king read it or had it read to him, and there was nothing in it he could act against, because to punish Locke he would first have had to unwrite the record, and the record cannot be unwritten, and that soft square of the ledger's cream page, filled in Master Corwin's narrow hand, was the true fortress Locke had spent his 20 lawful minutes building. Not the muscle of the man, the record. He had known, walking into that hall, that the only thing strong enough to protect a doorman from a queen's revenge was the record, and so he had made very sure, at every step, to be doing the record's work and not his own, so that afterward the record would stand between him and her like a wall he himself had helped to build. And then the second thing happened, the thing that turned Morwenna's demand for justice back upon her own head, and it happened because Master Corwin, having been asked whether an assault occurred, was obliged as herald to also record how the coronet had come out of the sealed treasury in the first place. Because a thing taken from sealed keeping means a seal was broken, and a broken seal is the herald's own dominion, and no queen in the world can wave that away. So the herald's people examined the treasury case, and they found Perrin's clever trick with the wax, and they found the true break beneath the false whole seal, and they found, because a frightened, indebted underkeeper does not stand up well to the questions of the herald's people, Perrin himself, who confessed the whole of it in an afternoon, who had come to him, what she had promised, what she had threatened, what he had done in the dead of night and brought to her rooms. And all of that, too, went into the record. It was Perrin's confession in the end, and not the scene in the Hall of Vows that finished Morwenna at court. The scene had shamed her. The confession undid her. because the scene could be argued about a matter of ceremony, of pride, of a soldier's presumption. But the confession was a plain crime, plainly recorded, plainly witnessed. The sworn consort of the house had suborned a keeper, procured the breaking of the herald's seal, and taken the property of the house by fraud in the dark. That is not a matter for taste. That is not smoothed over at a great occasion. And even a weak and loving old king cannot unknow a thing once it is written down and read to him in his own sister's steady voice. Adela saw to the reading of it. Adela made sure the king heard every line, gently but completely, and Adela stood by while the old man wept for the last of his illusions about the woman he had married, and then she stood by while he did, at last, the thing he had been unable to do in the hall, while he said, in a cracked and broken old voice, but aloud and for the record, the plain word asterisk, no asterisk. Morwenna was not thrown into a cell. The house does not deal so crudely with its own, and there were the children to think of, and the king, even at the end, would not have that. But she was finished. She kept her title and lost every particle of the power behind it. She was removed from the king's household and given a distant house and a modest keeping and the strict, recorded understanding that she would never again hold any office, touch any property of the house, or stand within the order of any rite. Her scheme to graft her own children onto the first queen's line died with the reading of Perrin's confession. Cassius and Verena remained what they had always been, the king's blood but not the first blood, and the line ran true through Ilara as the record had always said it would. The coronet of the late Queen Isolde went back into the sealed treasury under a new seal, and there it stayed until, in the fullness of time and by the law of the house and the proper order of things, it passed at last to the Princess Ilara, placed on her head not by force and not by fraud in the dark, but in open day, by right, with the record witnessing, which is the only way a crown is worth wearing. And that is what became of the scheme. The wrong was answered. The record was kept. The line ran true. If the story ended there, it would be a good enough story, a clean story, the kind of thing that makes a man feel the world is more just than he feared. But it does not end there for me, because I was young that day, and the thing I did not yet understand, the thing it took me years to understand, was the man himself. And so I have to tell you about Gethin Locke. I said at the start that his name does not matter much to the events, and that is true, and it is also the exact opposite of true, because the whole of what happened only makes sense once you understand that a man like Locke does not appear at the necessary moment by luck. He was made, over a long, quiet lifetime of choices no one witnessed, into the kind of instrument the moment could use. And the making of him is the real lesson buried in the loud story of the crown. He had served the late Queen Isolde. I knew that much on the day. Everyone knew it. It was the sort of thing said of the older men. He served the first Queen asterisk, the way you might say of a tree that it had stood through a famous storm. What I did not know, and only learned in the years after, when Locke had grown old enough and I had grown old enough that he would speak of such things across a barracks table at the tail of a long night, was what that service had meant to him. Isolde had been, by every account, a fine queen and a finer person, plain-spoken, fair, without cruelty, the sort of royal who learns the names of the grooms and remembers them years later. She had noticed Locke when he was young. Not favored him exactly, she was too fair for favorites, but noticed him, the quality in him, the exactness, and she had once told him a thing that he carried the rest of his life. He told it to me only once, and I will set it down as near to his words as I can hold them. She had found him, he said, standing his post one winter dawn, a young guardsman half frozen and perfectly still, and she had stopped the Queen on her way to some early duty and looked at him a while, and then she had said, "You know why we keep men like you, Sergeant? Not to frighten anyone, not for show, though the show is pretty. We keep you because a house is only as good as the things it will not let happen, even when no one is looking and no one would blame it for looking away. That is you. You are the thing the house will not let happen. Remember that, when the day comes that they tell you to look away. And she had gone on, and he had stood there in the cold with those words settling into him like a foundation being poured, and he had, he said, never once forgotten them, and he had waited his whole life, not eagerly, not hoping for it, but faithfully, for the day someone would tell him to look away so that he could refuse. That day was the Ashwater. That is why he was not surprised. That is why his face did not change when the crown came through the western doors. He had been rehearsing this exact refusal in the quiet chamber of himself for a quarter of a century, ever since a dead queen told a frozen young man on a winter morning what he was for. When Morwenna walked in wearing Isolde's own stolen crown to steal Isolde's own daughter's place, she was not merely breaking a law in front of Gethin Locke. She was doing the precise thing the woman who made him had warned him would one day come. She was daring the whole house to look away, and Locke had answered her before she ever crossed the floor, answered her 1,000 times in 1,000 cold dawns, and all that was left for him to do in the Hall of Vows was to say aloud, at last, the no asterisk he had been keeping ready his whole life. He was not brave that day, he told me, in the way I thought he was brave. Bravery, he said, is doing the frightening thing without knowing how it comes out. I knew how it came out. I'd known for 20 years. All I did was arrive on time. That was the most he would ever claim for himself. But I was there, and I will claim more for him than he would claim, because I watched it. And there is a courage in the arriving that the man who arrives can never quite see in himself. It is easy, in the safe imagining of a cold dawn, to decide that you will one day refuse to look away. It is another thing entirely to actually step off your post, in front of 400 people who want you to sit down, against a queen who can end your life, with the king silent and the lords rising and a mob forming and no one moving with you, and to walk out onto that open floor alone with nothing in your hands but a folded scrap of oath and a trust in a record. 1,000 men have made Locke's private vow in the safety of their own hearts. Perhaps 1 in 1,000 of those keeps it when the floor tilts and the cost comes due, and the whole weight of the powerful leans in to whisper that just this once, just this morning, just to keep the peace, it would be wiser to be furniture. Locke kept it. And the keeping of it when the tilting floor came is the only kind of courage the world ever actually needs, because vows kept only in the heart save no one, and it is the man who keeps his in the open air, at the necessary hour, at the real cost. Who is the difference between a house that holds and a house that rots? I have wondered, too, about the cost to him that did not show. Morwenna had promised to make him an enemy, and she was as good as her word in the small ways still open to her. There were slights, and postings to the worst gates, and a promotion that came late and grudging when it should have come at once, and a long low current of disfavor from the parts of the house that had been shamed that day and never forgave the man who shamed them. Powerful people forgive the wrong they do far sooner than they forgive the witness who saw them do it. Locke bore all of it the way he bore everything, without complaint and without apparent notice. And when I once, hotly as a younger man, protested to him that it was unjust, that he of all men should have been raised up and honored, he looked at me with those pale reading eyes and said the last thing I will give you of his, because it is the thing I have tried hardest to live by. You have it backward, he said. I didn't keep the record so the house would reward me. If I'd wanted a reward, I'd have chosen a different trade. I kept the record because the record is the only thing that outlasts all of us, the kings and the queens and the schemers and the doormen, all of us. And a man is lucky, once or twice in a life, to get to put his shoulder against the one thing that lasts. They can post me to the worst gate in the kingdom. I'll stand it. I got to be, for about 20 minutes, the thing the house would not let happen. That's not a debt they owe me. That's a debt I owed and got the chance to pay. You don't ask to be thanked for paying what you owe. I have turned that over for the whole of my life, and the more I turn it, the truer it gets. We spend so much of our thought on the loud kind of virtue, the rescue, the charge, the grand refusal in front of the crowd, and we forget that the loud kind is only ever the last inch of a very long private road. Locke's 20 minutes in the Hall of Vows were watched by 400 people. The 25 years of cold dawns that made those minutes possible were watched by no one. That is the shape of it always. The thing the house will not let happen is not a moment. It is a man, made ready over a lifetime, standing where he was put, having decided long before that he would not look away. And the terrible, hopeful truth of it is that any of us can be that man in our own smaller halls, if we will only do the quiet, unwitnessed work of deciding, once and for all and long before the test, what we will not permit, so that when the crown comes through the doors, we are not still making up our minds. We have already made them up. All that is left is to arrive on time. What became of the rest of them, you will want to know, and I will tell you, because a story owes its people an ending. The king did not live many more years. The winter that had weakened him never fully let him go, and he faded through 2 more of them, and Adela and Alara and Rowan carried more and more of the house between them as he receded, until one gray spring he simply did not wake, and was mourned honestly, for he had been a good man overtaken by an old man's weakness, and the weakness had cost the house one dreadful mourning, but had not, in the end, cost it the thing that mattered, because the wall had held when the king could not. It is a hard thing to say of a sovereign that his greatest service was to give, at the last necessary instant, a half-inch nod when he could not manage a word, but I have come to think there was a kind of grace in that nod, the grace of a failing man who could not save the house himself and had the wit and the humility at the end to let a better-placed hand do it, and to lend that hand his leave. Not every weak king even manages that much. Alaric managed it. It was little, and it was, at the one hinge of the day, exactly enough. Alara came to the throne in time, not through the Ashwater which makes nothing, but through the ordinary succession which makes everything. And she was, as those who witnessed her stillness that morning always knew she would be, a queen very much in the mold of her mother, plain-spoken, exact, without cruelty, a learner of names. And the first great act of her reign, done quietly, without ceremony, in a way the loud story of the crown never records, was to send for the record of the Ashwater and read it through, the whole of it, Corwin's narrow account of the asking and the answering and the recovering, and then to send for the men named in it. She raised Master Corwin's office, and secured the herald's independence against any future sovereign's convenience, so that no king's weakness could ever again silence the record when the record needed to speak. She saw to the pardon of poor Perrin, the underkeeper, who had done a wrong thing under threat, and confessed it fully and paid in fear, and she gave him honest work far from any treasury, and she sent for Gethin Locke. I was there for that, too, at the end of the line of my own duty, and so I can tell you it was not a grand scene. She did not make him a lord. She knew him too well, and knew the trade too well, to insult him with a reward he had already told the world he did not want. She simply had him brought to her, and she stood, the queen stood, for the sergeant, and she said, "You lifted my mother's crown from a thief's head so that it could one day come honestly to mine. I know exactly what that cost you, and exactly how little you have asked for it, and I know you would refuse anything I tried to give you and mean the refusal. So I will not give you a thing. I will give you a fact, for the record, since the record is the only coin you respect." And she turned to Master Corwin, who stood ready with the ledger open, and she said, "Enter it. That on the day of the Ashwater, when the house could not save itself and the king could not speak, one sworn man remembered the whole of his oath and kept the whole of the record, at the whole of the cost, and asked for nothing. Enter his name in full. Let it outlast all of us as he wished. That is the only reward he will take, and so it is the one I will pay." And Master Corwin entered it in his narrow hand, and Gethin Locke, who had stood unmoved before a queen's fury and a lord's mob, and the whole shamed weight of the powerful without his face so much as changing, Gethin Locke, at the sight of his own name going into the thing he loved, had to look, for just a moment, at the floor. That is the only time in all the years I knew him that I saw the man come close to being unmade, and it was not fury or fear or the queen's fury that nearly did it. It was being seen, exactly and truly for what he was, and having it written down where it would keep. He had spent his whole life being furniture, a fixture, a part of the wall, and had asked for nothing else, and had genuinely wanted nothing else. And yet there is a hunger even in the most self-effacing man to be, once, correctly known, and Alara had reached past every reward he would have refused and given him the one he could not. She gave him the record. She gave him the certainty that 400 years from now, when every soul who stood in the Hall of Vows that morning was dust and forgotten, the ledger would still say, in a herald's steady hand, that one sworn man had remembered his oath when it mattered. For a man who believed that the record was the only thing that outlasts us, that was not a decoration. That was a kind of immortality, and it was the only kind he had ever wanted, and she knew it, and she gave it to him, and it very nearly broke the unbreakable man in two. Locke stood many more years of posts after that, at good gates and bad ones both, and grew old the slow, honorable way that guardsmen do, and taught a great many young green fools like the one I had been. And I do not think he ever spoke of the Ashwater to any of them unless they asked, and even then he told it flat and short and gave himself none of the credit, and said only that he had arrived on time. When he finally laid the tunic down, he did it without ceremony, on an ordinary morning, and walked out the gate he had guarded for so long into an ordinary retirement, and if you had passed him on the road, you would have seen only a lean, weathered old man with pale eyes, a part of the wide world's furniture, nothing to mark him at all. That is how it is with the ones who hold. They do not glow, they do not announce themselves. They stand where they are put, and they keep what they swore to keep, and they let the record do their glowing for them long after they are gone. As for me, I stood a great many more posts, as I said at the start, and I learned the trade well enough in the end, and I like to think I was of some use to the house across a long life on its walls. But I have never done a truer thing than the small foolish thing I did that morning, when I was 23 and green and frightened, when I stepped off my own post and put myself at the foot of the dais steps below my sergeant with my shaking voice and my hand on a hilt I did not draw, and said the true thing in my own smaller way, because he had said it first and shown me it could be said. He made that possible. That is the last thing I want you to understand about a man like Locke. He does not only keep the record himself. He shows the frightened boy beside him that the record can be kept, that the wall can move when it must, that a doorman's oath is not a fine old form of empty words but a live thing you can actually stand on when the floor tilts. And in the showing, he makes a second wall and a third and a 100th out of ordinary young men who did not know, until they watched him, what they were capable of standing for. That is the real inheritance he left, not the story of the crown, loud as it is. The quiet certainty, passed hand to hand down all the years since, that the house has men in it who will not look away. I am an old man now myself, older than Locke was that morning, and my posts are all behind me, and the young ones ask me sometimes to tell the story of the day the guard took the Queen's crown, and I tell it, and they always want it to be about the reaching up, the drama, the crown lifted in the gold light, the Queen unmade. I let them have that part because it is a good part and it is true. But when they have gone off satisfied, I sit a while longer, and I think about the 25 cold dawns behind the 20 loud minutes, and the half-inch nod of a failing king, and a herald's steady finger on a 400-year-old line, and a queen who paid a debt in the only coin an honest man would take, and a frightened boy who found his own smaller courage in the shadow of a braver one. And I understand, as I did not understand that morning, that no one took anything from anyone that day. A crown was not taken. A crown was returned to the record, to the line, to the truth of things by a man who had decided long before, on a winter dawn no one witnessed, that he was the thing the house would not let happen. He only arrived on time, but he arrived. And because one lean, weathered doorman arrived on time, the record held, and the line ran true, and the house stood, and it stands yet, on the shoulders of the men who will not move until honor tells them to, and then move exactly as far as honor requires, and not 1 inch more.